Right now, a stretch of ground in Southern California is shaking in a way that has seismologists watching their monitors more closely than usual. Not because of one massive jolt, not because a single fault just ruptured, but because dozens of small earthquakes have been firing off in rapid succession, clustered together in space and time, with no clear leader among them. That absence of a leader is exactly the problem. It is the signature of what scientists call an earthquake swarm, and this particular swarm is happening in one of the most closely watched patches of crust in the entire country, sitting almost directly at the southern end of the San Andreas Fault. A section of that fault has stayed silent for more than 300 years. So when the ground nearby starts trembling like this, the question isn't whether people should be mildly curious. The question is whether this is the beginning of something the region has been quietly dreading for decades. Here's how it started. In the middle of the night, a small earthquake broke loose several kilometers underground, not large enough on its own to make headlines anywhere in the world. Southern California produces earthquakes like this constantly, and most of them vanish into background statistics within minutes. But this one didn't stay alone. Within the hour, a second earthquake struck nearly the same location, slightly stronger than the first. Then a third arrived, and a fourth. And by the time morning light hit the farmland above, monitoring stations had logged more than a dozen separate earthquakes stacked on top of each other in almost the same tiny patch of ground. None of them were particularly large by themselves, but the pattern they formed together was the part worth paying attention to. A normal earthquake sequence follows a script most people already know instinctively, even if they've never studied seismology. One big earthquake happens first. It's the main shock, the one that makes the news, the one that shakes dishes off shelves and cracks plaster. After that, a string of aftershocks follows, each one smaller than the last, gradually fading out over hours, days, sometimes weeks, until the ground finally settles back into quiet. It's a shrinking pattern, a curve heading down, predictable in a rough statistical sense because it comes from a single fault surface breaking and then slowly releasing the leftover strain. A swarm breaks that entire script. Instead of one dominant earthquake followed by a fading tail, you get a cluster of earthquakes that are all roughly similar in size, showing up in bursts, sometimes going quiet for hours and then flaring back up without warning. There's no main shock to point to. There's no clean curve heading towards zero. The strongest earthquake so far might already have happened, or the sequence might still be building towards something larger. Nobody can say for certain, and that uncertainty isn't a gap in the science. It's baked directly into how swarms actually work. What drives that difference usually comes down to what's happening underground. A typical main shock is fundamentally a stress story. Tectonic plates grind against each other for decades or centuries. Strain slowly accumulates along a fault line, and eventually the rock simply can't hold anymore and it snaps. A swarm tends to have a different engine behind it. In many documented cases, fluid moving through cracks in the rock, shifting pressure across a whole tangled network of small fault strands, letting them slip a little at a time, rather than all at once in one dramatic release. That's part of why swarms behave so unpredictably. They aren't following the tidy statistical decay of a single fracture relaxing. They're responding to fluid migration, and fluid can start, stop, pause, and restart in ways a single clean rupture simply doesn't. This isn't the first time this exact stretch of ground has behaved this way, and it almost certainly won't be the last. The area has a well-documented history of swarm behavior, stretching back years, sometimes producing sequences that fizzle out within a day, and other times producing sequences that build for weeks, and eventually include an earthquake strong enough to wake an entire region out of bed. Earlier this year, essentially the same underlying structure lit up in a similar pattern, starting small, climbing, through the afternoon, and eventually producing an earthquake strong enough to be felt hundreds of kilometers away, all the way out toward the coast. That earlier episode is genuinely useful context here, because it shows exactly what this underlying system is capable of producing once conditions line up the right way. And going back further, similar reactivations have shown up roughly once every several years, meaning this region essentially wakes up periodically, shakes for a while, and then goes dormant again until the next cycle begins. Every time that cycle restarts, it resets the one question nobody can answer with confidence in advance. Where does this particular sequence actually end up topping out? The wider region surrounding this zone has an even longer track record, and it gives you a rough sense of where the practical ceiling for these events tends to sit. A little over a decade ago, a swarm just north of this same general area produced two separate earthquakes above, magnitude 5, one in the low fives, and another slightly stronger, along with hundreds of smaller shocks trailing behind them, causing minor damage to older structures nearby at the time. Decades before that, a nearby earthquake reached into the high fives, though that particular event behaved more like a conventional main shock followed by a shrinking tail of aftershocks rather than a true leaderless swarm. And more recently, another swarm centered near a neighboring geothermal area grew active, enough that the Geological Survey issued a formal aftershock forecast before activity eventually settled back down, with more than 60 separate earthquakes above magnitude 3 recorded before it wound down. Put all of that together, and you get a rough working, ceiling for swarm-type sequences in this general zone somewhere in the neighborhood of magnitude 5.5. Big enough to break windows, crack plaster, and rattle nerves across an entire community, but historically not the kind of event that levels a region on its own. Zoom out just slightly, and you start to see why this specific location carries so much more weight than an equivalent swarm almost anywhere else in the country would. This patch of ground isn't some random, forgettable corner of the map. It functions almost like a mechanical joint connecting two much bigger structures, the place where one major fault system essentially hands off motion to another as you move north. And the fault picking up that motion right at this junction happens to be the San Andreas itself, specifically the southernmost stretch of it, running up along a long, sparsely populated shoreline before eventually reaching the edges of far more densely populated valleys and metropolitan areas beyond. That particular segment of the San Andreas has one very specific, very well-documented problem: silence. It hasn't produced a major rupture in longer than 300 years, based on detailed trenching studies where researchers dug directly across the fault line and carefully dated the disturbed layers of soil to reconstruct a rupture history stretching back centuries. That research worked out a rough average recurrence interval for this section, somewhere in the range of one major rupture every 150 to 200 years. Do the simple arithmetic, and this stretch of fault isn't just due for another rupture at some point in the abstract future. By that historical average, it's already sitting well past due. So when a swarm fires up near the doorway feeding directly into that fault, the obvious question basically writes itself before anyone even has to ask it out loud. Could a cluster of small, seemingly harmless earthquakes somehow nudge a much larger, long overdue fault into finally letting go? There's a genuinely fascinating theory floating around in the research community that tries to explain why this particular stretch of fault has stayed so unusually quiet for so long, and it involves a lake that barely exists anymore in its historical form. For thousands of years, the low-lying basin running alongside this fault segment was periodically filled by an enormous ancient body of water far larger and deeper than the shrinking, shallow remnant that occupies roughly the same footprint today. Research published in recent years found something genuinely striking when researchers cross-referenced the fault's rupture history against the lake's water levels over time. The last several major ruptures along this exact stretch of the San Andreas each appear to line up closely with periods when that ancient lake was full and heavy. The sheer weight of all that water sitting directly above the fault may have been acting almost like a natural trigger, helping the fault release its built-up strain on a somewhat more predictable, regular schedule throughout history. That lake has largely disappeared over the past century, and its absence may be exactly why the fault's internal clock appears to have slowed down so dramatically compared to its historical average. Here's the genuinely unsettling part of that theory. If the ancient lake really was helping this fault release its accumulated strain on a semi-regular schedule, then losing the lake never actually made the fault any safer. It simply removed one of the fault's natural release mechanisms. The underlying strain has kept quietly accumulating this entire time regardless, with researchers estimating several meters of it now stored within this section of fault. Ongoing silence, in other words, isn't the same thing as safety. It looks a lot more like a loaded spring with its safety catch stuck firmly in place. The honest answer, the one grounded in the actual physics rather than headline anxiety, is that the underlying mechanism connecting the two is real, but it's weak, and distance ends up mattering enormously. Earthquakes genuinely do change the stress acting on nearby sections of crust. A small earthquake shifts the pressure on the rock around it just slightly, and that shift can, in theory, nudge a nearby fault a little closer to failure. But for a moderate magnitude, 3 or 4 earthquake, that stress change only matters meaningfully across a range of a few kilometers at most. Which means the real level of concern here depends almost entirely on how close this swarm actually is to the fault segment in question. If this activity were happening directly on top of the fault's southern end, the situation would look considerably more serious. As it stands, this swarm sits a meaningful distance away from that terminus, close enough to keep the underlying question alive and worth tracking, but far enough that the direct stress being transferred onto the San Andreas itself remains genuinely small. Zoom out to a global scale and the picture becomes even more reassuring, at least statistically. Documented cases exist around the world of a small earthquake swarm preceding a much larger nearby earthquake days or weeks later. But those cases represent a small minority. The overwhelming majority of swarms simply rise for a while, sputter, and fade back into ordinary background seismic noise without producing anything larger, It would be dishonest to sit here and sell pure fear without also giving you that realistic base rate. The single most likely outcome for a sequence like this one is that it behaves almost exactly like the swarms this region has already produced before, climbing for a period of hours or days, possibly reaching a moderate magnitude, strong, enough to rattle windows and startle people awake, and then gradually dying back down without producing anything larger. That's genuinely the base case here, and it's where the smart money sits if you were forced to place a bet on the outcome. Globally, researchers estimate that somewhere between roughly 5 and 10% of moderate earthquakes eventually turn out, in hindsight, to have been foreshocks that preceded something considerably larger. The catch embedded in that number is important. There is no reliable way to identify a foreshock while it's actually happening. That label only gets applied retroactively after the bigger earthquake shows up and forces a reclassification. Until that moment, a foreshock looks statistically indistinguishable from the thousands of small earthquakes every single week that lead to absolutely nothing at all. So if anyone tells you with complete confidence that this specific swarm is definitely a warning sign for something enormous about to happen, they're claiming a level of predictive certainty that no working seismologist on the planet actually possesses. It's also worth being precise about where the genuinely proven, well-documented danger in this region actually comes from, because it isn't the swarm activity itself. The broader fault network connected to this area carries a long, well-recorded history of destructive earthquakes stretching back more than a century. Events that have injured people, damaged buildings, and reshaped emergency planning across the region multiple times over. Those larger, historically documented earthquakes are the real reason residents throughout this part of the state keep an emergency kit ready near the door. The swarm activity itself is really more of a noisy symptom sitting on top of a much older, much better understood hazard. Still, there's a legitimate reason to keep a close eye on this specific zone, and it has nothing to do with manufacturing unnecessary alarm. This happens to be one of the only places anywhere in the country where the Geological Survey maintains an actual operational protocol allowing it to publicly recalculate and share updated earthquake odds in something close to real time whenever activity here picks up. That protocol exists precisely because this zone has already prompted formal public action on at least a couple of prior occasions, and understanding what happened during those earlier episodes tells you almost everything about how seriously professionals treat activity in this exact location. A few years back, a swarm broke out essentially right on top of the fault's southern terminus itself, not 60 kilometers away like this week's activity, but directly at the point where the fault begins. That swarm eventually grew to include roughly 100 separate earthquakes. And because it was sitting precisely where the fault meets its most dangerous quiet segment, the Geological Survey did something it almost never does. It ran real-time probability calculations and publicly announced a sharply elevated chance of a major rupture striking that section of the San Andreas within the following week, at one point placing the odds nearly 100 times higher than the normal background rate for any typical week. State emergency officials issued a formal advisory. Preparedness messaging went out widely. And then, over the following days, the swarm gradually faded, the elevated odds decayed back down toward normal background levels, and the advisory quietly expired without an accompanying major earthquake ever materializing. That outcome wasn't a failure of the underlying science. It was the science working exactly as designed. Even a dramatically elevated 1 in 100 chance still means nothing happens 99 times out of 100. 2 lessons from that earlier episode are worth carrying forward into how you interpret this current swarm. First, this entire monitoring system is built around transparency and public disclosure rather than quiet concealment behind closed doors. And second, the reason those odds spiked so dramatically during that earlier swarm, and the reason this week's activity likely carries a meaningfully lower elevated risk in comparison, comes down to one single governing variable above everything else: distance to the fault's actual terminus. That earlier swarm sat almost directly on top of it. This week's swarm sits considerably farther away. There's one more thread worth addressing directly, because misinformation tends to spread fastest in exactly these kinds of moments. Whenever a notable earthquake sequence makes headlines anywhere in the country, it's common to see people online trying to connect it to some other unrelated earthquake that happened around the same general time somewhere else entirely, implying some kind of hidden continental scale link between the two. It's worth taking that instinct apart cleanly rather than simply dismissing it, because dismantling it honestly is more useful than ignoring it. 2 earthquakes, separated by many hours and well over 1,000 kilometers of distance, simply cannot be physically connected through any known stress transfer mechanism. The stress that one earthquake can meaningfully transfer onto another fault fades away within just a handful of kilometers for a moderate magnitude event, and within a somewhat larger radius for anything approaching magnitude 5. There is no known physical pathway linking a swarm in one part of the country to an unrelated moderate earthquake happening a continent's width away. What you're actually looking at in cases like that is coincidence, plain and simple. This planet produces roughly 150 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or larger every single week worldwide. Two unusual events landing in the same general window of time isn't evidence of some hidden pattern connecting them. It's simply what ordinary randomness looks like once you zoom out to a global scale. So here's the part that actually matters if you want to track this yourself, rather than just waiting for headlines to tell you what happened after the fact. There are essentially three concrete signals researchers watch closely whenever a swarm like this fires up near a major fault system, and all three are things you can follow on your own without any specialized training. The first signal is magnitude. If this sequence stays roughly where it started, hovering in the low to moderate range without climbing meaningfully higher, that's the reassuring version of events. But if activity keeps climbing, especially if it approaches or exceeds the strongest earthquakes this same zone has produced during past episodes, that meaningfully changes the underlying risk calculation. Because every step up the magnitude scale represents a dramatic jump in released energy rather than a small incremental increase. Events that keep climbing rather than gradually fading are the first genuine signal worth paying close attention to. The second signal is direction. Where exactly are the individual earthquakes actually migrating over time? If activity stays essentially contained within the same tight patch of ground where it started, that remains the far more reassuring scenario. But if the cluster of earthquakes begins visibly migrating toward the fault's actual terminus, moving closer and closer to that historically silent, long overdue segment, that's the scenario that genuinely matters most, because that's precisely the kind of migration that turned a distant, low-concern swarm into a nationally reported near-miss during that earlier episode years ago. Location is essentially everything with this particular hazard, and migration toward the fault terminus is the single most important thing to track over the coming days. The third signal is official confirmation. If the Geological Survey formally issues an updated aftershock forecast, or if state emergency officials issue a genuine public advisory the way they did during that earlier episode at the fault's terminus, that's your clearest possible signal that professionals have already run the real numbers behind closed doors and concluded the underlying odds have shifted enough to justify saying so publicly. Advisories like that don't get issued casually. When they show up, they're worth taking seriously. Bring it back to where this all started. The ground beneath this stretch of farmland began shaking again in that same irregular, stuttering rhythm it's produced before. No clean main shock, no tidy fading curve, just a cluster of moderate earthquakes arriving in bursts with no clear endpoint yet visible. Based on everything this region has done in every previous comparable episode, the most likely outcome by a wide margin is that it does exactly what it has done before. It rises for a while, rattles some windows, generates a few uneasy nights for the people living nearby, and then gradually fades back into ordinary background seismic activity without producing anything larger than a moderate earthquake. If you happen to live anywhere near this area, the realistic thing to actually prepare for right now is a handful of restless nights, not some looming catastrophic event. But the reason any of this remains genuinely worth paying attention to isn't really the swarm itself. It's the much larger, much quieter fault sitting patiently right next door, silent for more than 3 centuries, carrying an enormous amount of accumulated strain that hasn't found a release valve in generations, sitting a meaningful distance away from a patch of ground that simply won't stop trembling. Science can reasonably estimate the odds that any individual swarm nudges that larger fault a little closer to failure, and right now, those odds remain genuinely low. What science still can't fully explain is why the most heavily loaded, most historically significant section of arguably the most famous fault on the entire continent has managed to stay so remarkably still, while almost everything around it keeps shaking in fits and starts, or which swarm someday finally ends that long, uneasy silence for good.